Kowloon High School Chronicle, a DRPG developed by Shout Designworks and published by Atlus for the PlayStation 2 in 2004, long seemed a game region-locked to Japan and sadly missed here in North America. That was of course until a surprise announcement in early 2021, which was followed very quickly by the game's release on Nintendo Switch just a couple weeks later. For many of us, myself included, this was our first time hearing of the game, which made it even more shocking to find out that this is a title with some pedigree. Not only was there notable talent working on the title, but the game itself saw a fair bit of success for the genre as an influential cult hit. Perhaps a bit ironically as well, considering how much influence this game takes from other films and anime, and proudly wears those influences on its sleeve. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, and we'll look more into that later. To help with Kowloon's growing success, an expanded edition of the game was greenlit and released later, which added a new optional dungeon, new epilogue content, and new recruitable support characters. That version, however, is not the version Sega, Atlus, and Arc Sys used when creating this remaster. Though I had trouble finding definitive answers I could personally verify for why this version wasn't used, I feel some amount of comfort in taking the word of other people in my social circle who can more easily and readily research Japanese articles that I cannot. And what follows here is the explanation I got from them, and what I'm taking as a tentative truth. Unfortunately, as it appears, the expanded edition of Kowloon, when dug up for this remaster, was found to have many lost and damaged assets. Upon analysis, the cost of rebuilding and fixing it for release was simply deemed too high. Though this base version had damaged assets that needed to be recreated as well, the undertaking was far more financially viable. But this release didn't just stop at fixing broken assets and slapping the game on Switch. The team in charge went back to get new voice lines recorded, giving Kowloon, for the first time in its unorthodox release history, a fully voiced story mode. Granted, it is Japanese only, but fully voiced nonetheless. So then, here we are, 17 years from its initial release, and with very little lead up or marketing for North Americans to even take note of, Kowloon High School Chronicle: Origin of Adventure has finally arrived. What lies ahead is much like the treasures our main character seeks in the game. Kowloon is a gem, however only recently uncovered and not yet given the polish it needs to shine to its fullest potential. It is a rough relic of a bygone era, one that oozes charm and inspires intrigue, yet still carries the must of a thing that's been tucked away for far too long and left uncared for. This is not a game for everybody, but despite all of its issues, it still ended up being a game for me and my unique, shall we say, sensibilities. With that rather long intro taken care of, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Arc Sys for providing the code for this review, and also for finally seeing this game to foreign audiences. It may be long overdue, but in fairness, I feel there's far more audience out there for this type of game than there was 17 years ago. So let's get into it then. Let's first talk about that title, the general visual novel segment stuff, the formula, story, characters, side quests, conversation mechanics, basically everything you're going to be doing while you're not exploring the dungeons and engaging in combat. But strap in, this is a pretty long chunk of the video. Let's start with the title and just get this out of the way, because this can be a tad mystifying. When it comes to world history and geopolitics and stuff like that, I have the IQ of a banana. But when it comes to video games, I am at least cognizant of other games that share the Kowloon name. I'm also aware that they're not related at all, so I wanted to find out where the name comes from and what it means. To my surprise, this is not just a Japanese word that survived localization, but is rather the name of a place in Hong Kong with a very storied history. In an extremely condensed and not all that useful explanation, Kowloon used to be a great walled-off city made entirely of interlinking buildings packed tighter than a can of sardines. This city was mostly independent, with many of its residents living there to escape governmental restrictions and guidelines. The buildings were not built to code, and health and safety measures simply did not exist beyond what they wanted them to. Though somewhat anarchist, the people who lived there made it work and largely cherished the little world they created for themselves, as rampant with crime and disease as this world was. This was, of course, until ownership of the land was ceded and the great walled city of Kowloon was forced to be evacuated. Mesmerizing as this sprawling maze of buildings was, in 1993, Hong Kong's walled-off city Kowloon was completely demolished. Kowloon High School Chronicle takes place in 2004 in Tokyo, Japan. So yeah, not this place or time period at all. Hell, it doesn't even take place in the modern city of Kowloon, but I guess in small ways it references and borrows conceptual ideas from the old one. But it was at least fun to learn about, right? Now let's start the story section by saying Kowloon High School Chronicle is anime as f***, and I mean that with love. The game is divided into chapters, or episodes rather, referred to as discoveries. Each discovery follows a monster of the week, or rather a treasure of the week style formula, beginning and ending with anime style credit reels. And the anime isn't relegated just to the formula. If you happen to notice Minigame already, you may feel there's a bit of Cowboy Bebop, Spike Spiegel inspiration here, and you wouldn't be wrong. Just get a load of this intro sequence. I mean, this is straight Cowboy Bebop, and I ain't even mad. It's a good style, and this theme is friggin' fire. Plus, since the game took so long getting here, it feels more like a nostalgia trip to me than some self-aware, lazy piece of reference material. But yeah, expect a lot of reference to 90s and early 2000s anime, and also Indiana Jones. There's a lot of that too. But it all plays into this game's incredibly unique sense of tone and style. A style that seeks to blend traditional Japanese stories with the Egyptian setting and treasure hunting of the Indiana Jones series. Seeing us through this anime is Habaki, our player character, member of the Rosetta Society and secret treasure hunter. Habaki is the newest transfer student to Kamiyoshi Academy. Though a student here full-time, Habaki is sent to the school undercover to investigate the ruins found at the school's cemetery and recover the rumored treasure that lies at its heart. And you don't need to be a detective to figure out that odd things have already begun. Most schools don't have cemeteries, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. As the newest transfer student, Habaki finds out quickly that the school has a bad history with transfer students, which partially necessitated the on-premises cemetery. But the transfer students, of course, aren't alone in creating their run of seemingly bad luck. Much of it is explained away as a curse by the student body. But from within the shadows, there operates a secret student council, monitoring the activities of these students and trying to prevent any of them from accessing the ruins. But for what purpose? Kowloon gives a compelling set of mysteries for the player to uncover, and with each new episode in this episodic anime odyssey, we meet new characters, unlock new dungeons, and push the mysteries deeper. It's not exactly trying to be high art or anything, and it's really not. Many of the episodic stories are very familiar, but they can still be rather touching nonetheless. And I mean, not to keep beating on this trope every time it comes up, but a lot of these stories do boil down to the real treasures being the friends or relationships you made along the way. But it at least does try to be genuine in fleshing that angle out. Where this game follows an anime formula, each episode follows a formula as well that it never really deviates from. We begin with our morning trips to school, socializing with other students, and introducing the new episode's mystery. After this, we reach our free period or lunchtime, where we can go around the school using this map here, talk to people in each room, see their affinity towards us and to the other students, and collect items by searching each room. Habaki is a silent main character, which typically I'm not a fan of, but he is handled rather well here in conversation. At certain points, you're given multiple choice responses to questions, but more often than not, you control the flow of conversation via the emotion input wheel. Here we have 9 options, somewhat questionably named and a little hard to read at first, but effective nonetheless. To my surprise, different responses can actually lead to substantially different event scenarios, some of which contain unique art stills. Students occasionally have side quests for you as well, but there's not much to these. They're small riddles of sorts where they describe a type of item they need and you simply give it to them if you have it. This free period can be skipped if you want, but I wouldn't recommend it. Building a good enough rapport with your students by choosing the right responses and completing their quests will unlock them as support characters for when you go spelunking later, but arguably even more importantly, it just really shapes them out. Most of our cast and crew seem rather archetypal at first, but there's definitely a lot behind them for those who care to look. I will note, however, that yes, some of the archetypes are very dated and some things played for comedy may come off as more offensive than intended, but a lot of it still holds up, and the more questionable moments are short-lived enough that it shouldn't come as a big issue even for the more sensitive. When the free period is over, you go back to school, get more of the story, and sometimes move into an evening event. When night falls, you get an opportunity again to go around and talk to the students. You can visit your dorm and finally descend into the dungeon. Though you can leave the dungeon anytime you're not in combat, this is where you'll be until you find and defeat the boss, trigger another visual novel segment, roll the episode end credits, then rinse and repeat. And I know you're probably ready to move move on to the dungeon and combat section, but I'm apparently committed to giving this review a snail's pace, so we can't just gloss over the dorm room. There's simply too much to do here to not talk about it. First, the crafting. This is rather limited, but I'd recommend getting familiar with it. You can make new healing items here, items for quests, and new weapons, but it's very cumbersome and archaic. Items are sorted into categories, but a recipe may require ingredients from more than one category, which of course causes a lot of flipping through tabs. This wouldn't be a huge deal, but you can only craft one of any item at a time. So if you want to make, say, 10 healing dishes, you're likely looking at no less than 50 button presses. Confusingly, the button for crafting is also the same as the button for consuming or using an item. You'll notice over the course of this review that controls are a frequent issue. In your dorm room, you can also look at the quest board. Here, people request treasures for you to find, which often come with very handsome rewards. The more quests for each person you complete, the more rewarding their quests will become. The quests themselves are absolute nonsense, and the riddles they come with to help you find the items you need can leave a lot to be desired. But if somebody wants to offer me 70 grand for a hamburger I found in an old tomb so they can serve it to guests at a mayoral race or whatever, I'm gonna take it. Besides, the economy in this game is very cruel otherwise. Aside from selling your gear for peanuts, this is really the only way to make substantial cash. And when you visit the online store, only accessible from your dorm room, you'll notice just how much cash is actually needed. Lastly, in this dorm room, you can also play an old PC game, which functions as a throwback DRPG in what is already now a dated DRPG. This minigame is pretty cool, and there's quite a lot of work put into it. Like the main game itself though, it suffers from similar issues in regards to pacing and difficulty spikes, which we'll talk about again a little bit later. But I do highly recommend you invest some time in this game, as it will increase your main character's stats in a few relevant categories. But that's about the long and short of the game outside of the dungeons. This is a fairly long game, with my save file ending around 70 hours, but my Switch telling me that I played for over 80. A product of some game overs, intentional suicide runs to test boss strategies and weaknesses, and save scumming to look at more crafting routes and leveling builds. Though I enjoyed my time with it, it's tough to say I was still fully invested at the end, feeling like the game was really starting to run its course and overstay its welcome. So despite the game trying to close with some more emotional stuff and trying to be more smart than it deserves with talks of big maths and smart science man stuff, by the time I made it there, I just couldn't care as much as I should have. Had the game gone on much longer, I may have begun to really sour on the idea of seeing it through to completion. But it rode the line about as close as it could come without going over. And now it's time to move into the dungeons and combat. A section of the game that feels both ahead of its time and very dated at the same time. So when you first descend into the dungeon, you're met with the largest room in the game. This is essentially the central hub of the dungeon, and where all other dungeons branch off from. With each new chapter, a new path unlocks from the central hub area, leading you to a new wing of the dungeon. The first few areas share similar graphic palettes, but designs vary more with each successive dungeon. In a way, it feels like the earliest dungeons are actually the largest, with each one getting smaller and smaller as you go down the inverted pyramid. But smaller doesn't necessarily mean shorter. It can be hard to gauge the length of time it would take to complete any of these dungeons, as various things can create lengthy holdups. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I got stuck on some really dumb things more than once. But in general, I want to say that they're all about 1 to 2 hours long. They're small compared to dungeons in other genre titles, but no room is really wasted here. And for what it's worth, the designs are not at all like your average dungeon crawler. These aren't mazes or anything where you're just looking for the exit to the next floor. They are very linear. In general, they come with two primary forms of challenges: puzzles and battles. Most of the puzzles are environmental and riddle based. They often require you to find or craft certain items, move objects around, or perform tasks in a specific pattern. The riddles can be rather confounding at times, and I'll admit, for the first time in my life, I actually went to a forum to seek help on one of them. But to the game's credit, this was entirely my fault for not interpreting the hint as intended. Kowloon High School Chronicle typically gives you all of the info you need to solve a puzzle, but getting into the mentality the game requires of you is a bit of an uphill struggle. Now, I say typically they give you all you need because there was 1 or 2 puzzles that I really didn't grasp even after brute forcing my way to the answer. For those couple puzzles, I can't say for certain I was provided with all the information I needed. That said, I personally love this focus on puzzles. It makes every room and every dungeon feel special, and it constantly gives you a new challenge. For the combat,
Reload your Winchester. The enemy's strength is down.
Well, combat is incredibly straightforward, but still leaves players a lot of room to experiment and optimize their efficiency with. To start, combat is not, and I repeat, not random encounters. Each event is scripted. Enemies are always placed in the same positions in the same rooms, and battle begins as soon as you enter a room. If you want to grind, you'll need to leave and re-enter the dungeon for the completed battles to be reset. Once battles start, in a Vagrant Story style fashion, you need to switch from your exploration mode to your battle mode. This is very important. If you don't do this, you may find yourself mashing what you think is your melee attack button, only to actually end up opening your inventory and destroying your extremely expensive and hard to replace assault rifle before you even realize what you've been doing. So yeah, pay very close attention to your modes. Now, when it comes to navigating your turn, this works more like an SRPG than your average turn-based dungeon crawler, except you really only have one character to control. You only have a small handful of things you can do on your turn, but you'll need to plan your turns carefully. You can move and shoot provided you have ammo, attack with your melee weapon, or throw a bomb or projectile provided you have those, or use your support character's limited abilities or use items. With the exception of the support character abilities, everything costs AP. It is your most valuable resource. Enemies also use AP, and you can see how much each of them has by looking at the chart at the top of the screen. And this will come in great handy when it's the enemy's turn, because annoyingly, you can't actually see them move unless they're in your line of sight from where your turn ended. So this, combined with a minimap if they happen to be close enough to you, becomes one of your only ways to track their movements at all. Combat ultimately comes down to a rather intense game of resource and risk management. The 3D plane and distance between you and the enemies is just as much an obstacle to account for as the enemy's attacks. So you're going to want to make sure you have enough AP to move to an advantageous position before attacking, attack, and then retreat to a safe zone. Though you can be more reckless in the front half of the game, in the second half, this isn't the case. One wrong move or poorly ended turn can spell certain doom. Although Kowloon High School Chronicle doesn't have very many enemy types, there are enough for this game, as it's the variety of positioning and enemy party builds that provide the real challenge. Enemy weaknesses are also an integral part of combat, and these go further than just attacking them with the right weapon, though that is about half the job. Different parts of an enemy's body register as a different hitbox. For something like a snake, you'll want to position yourself behind them to attack the mark on the back of their head. Or like these creatures here, you want to shoot their soft underbellies for max damage. That said, since ammo is such a valuable resource, especially early on, if you can kill them with your melee weapon, the only infinite resource you have for attacking, you're gonna want to favor that. If you're having trouble finding enemy weaknesses, you can also switch back to exploration mode in the middle of combat to examine them at a cost to about 10 AP. Or you could just brute force them with some general rules. Attacking from the side always gives a damage boost, but attacking from behind gives an even greater one. Your support characters come in great handy. As I said earlier, they don't use any AP. For me, I used one support character for healing and one for an area of effect attack. There is an armor and accessory slot to help in combat as well, armor by reducing enemy attacks and accessories by granting unique benefits or stat increases. Your armor will break over the course of getting attacked, but a single visit to any soul well, the dungeon save locations and safe rooms, will charge it back to full. So too will it charge your support character abilities, your HP, and your night vision goggles. Kowloon also supports a full gauntlet of status effects, and while many of them are ignorable when you have them, some of them are absolutely crippling. Something like a sprain will drop your total AP to 50% for a number of turns or until healed. Dealing with this can be tough, especially if you don't have a heal item for it, and you more than likely won't because your inventory only has 15 slots while you're exploring. But it gets worse. If you get dealt sprain damage while you're already sprained, then your status effect worsens and you're dropped down to 25% of your AP. Unless the battle is almost over, this is a good sign to just cancel out and start over, as there is little to nothing effective you can do to save yourself with only 25% of your AP. Such was the cause of a massive roadblock against a mid to late game boss for me. I spent a good chunk of time grinding in this game as boss difficulty spikes, though anything but consistent, could be absolutely insane at times. But the grind can be pretty rough as well. Though I'm not a fan of grinding myself, some grinding here and there is all well and good, but one particular stretch for me was way worse than the rest. The enemies I had to grind against in this particular stretch that provided the best experience had a special attack that I shit you not could completely drain your experience meter. Leveling doesn't come too fast or swift in this game, so this was just the worst. This is a rather dated mechanic, I guess, that I'm glad we don't see in games much anymore. Kowloon can be really, really cruel. That said, some of my need to grind may have been self-inflicted, as I didn't always know how I wanted or how I should be leveling my character. So let's look at the spec sheet now. Each time you gain a level, you earn points in 2 different categories and choose where in those categories you want the points to go. Abilities, as seen on the left side, control base stats, and these are pretty straightforward save for the Mind ability, which says it affects EXP and skill bonuses, but how and to what extent I never quite figured out. I didn't start investing in this one much until late game, hoping that it would actually up my defense or something, as there really seemed to be no ability for that, but I'm not exactly sure if it did. The subjects transform the gameplay significantly more than your abilities do, and while everything here is very useful, some of them are absolutely indispensable. Math to boost your lockpicking and PE to boost your jump distance, for instance. These are things you will absolutely want to max out as early as possible. Other stats such as English will boost the amount of things available in the online store, while political science lowers the costs of those items. Geo is another one you'll want to invest in heavily. This will lower the cost of AP while moving in battle, allowing you to attack far more often. Biology and ethics boost your damage against different types of enemies, though through save scumming I found the benefits of raising strength and insight in the abilities tab to be of even greater value, so I didn't invest too much in those two until I at least hit the 99 stat cap for my strength. I actually really like this leveling system though, as it gives a lot to experiment with, and shows even early on how much this game has to unlock. But it is almost annoying just how much rides on these. There are so many recipes I couldn't make and weapons I never unlocked in the store because I found myself needing to invest in other areas more heavily. If I ever do a second playthrough or just turn it on to mess around again, I'll likely explore those paths more just to see. And the last thing I want to touch on here were the controls I mentioned earlier. This is one of the areas the game will feel the most dated right from the offset. Strafing, for instance, is not done with the shoulder buttons and cannot be set to them as I've grown accustomed to. Interacting with world objects is slow and cumbersome. Even simple things like opening doors requires you to inspect them, then choose to open them, rather than simply pushing forward to proceed through them. Jumping also is a multi-step process that's a bit tough to get used to, but this is at least by design and serves a very real purpose. With this remaster, I think this would have been a good time to add some quality of life to the experience, but alas, this is not something they bothered with. While you will eventually get the hang of a lot of it over time, certain tasks like the aforementioned crafting will never not feel unintuitive. But yeah, with that said, expect like 10 or so hours before the controls really click. So yeah, that's the dungeons and combat. For me, I was mostly into this for the puzzles, but I can't deny that I like the combat as well. Sure, it's a limited set of things you can do on a rather turn-to-turn basis, and there's some rough edges. But those limited options encourage you to strategize harder and experiment more with your character builds every time you run into those rough edges. Though some rough edges I could stand to live without. EXP drain? That just ain't cool. But let's take a look at the technical aspects now and see what rough edges this gem has in that department. So, on the visual side, I don't know how to say this without sounding rude, but it looks like a PS2 game. But seriously, it's a PS2 game and it looks like one. Some people might look at the 3D environments and think they look bad, but I don't know, maybe I'm in a weird minority where this feels like home. I have a nostalgia for this. Aside from some of the dungeons with darker palettes, I think it looks great. The enemy designs and animations I love as well. Character designs, on the other hand, are a little bit shoddy. Their designs just aren't always that attractive, and though sometimes it's intentional, their anatomical correctness leaves a bit to be desired. It's probably worth noting here as well that there is a bit of nudity in this game, as many of you have likely already seen in some of the enemy designs. But some of your classmates appear in pretty provocative situations from time to time as well. But also, this has probably got to be one of the worst swimsuits I've ever seen in a video game. I'm no prude and I'm definitely down for the questionable swimsuit designs, but like, this one is just bad. Menu designs, they can use a little bit of work, but it's nothing overly worth complaining about. The music I showed a little bit of earlier, but I feel the whole soundtrack is pretty solid. That intro theme is easily one of the best, but other tracks like that of Madame Butterflies really gets me. The voiceovers are really good for the era, again, Japanese only, but I have no complaints here, aside from maybe one. While you're exploring, you have a PDA that announces important things, such as breakable walls or enemies being detected. And while this is immensely useful and you should really pay attention to what they're saying, they're simply a little too chatty. It's hard to say that I need to be told that I can access new levels every time I climb a ladder or a rope.
You can move to other brackets. 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 I received mail. It's been locked. Starting up Hans. Welcome to Hat.
The sound design doesn't really have anything noteworthy. It's maybe a little budget, but like it all serves its purpose. Performance, on the other hand, this is a bit of a tough one. While generally good, I did have the game freeze on me once for seemingly no reason. And there's some rooms where the frame rate runs considerably worse than the rest. It's pretty hard to understand why this is the case, considering it's a 17-year-old game running on modern hardware, but it is what it is. If this wasn't turn-based, it would be a big problem. As it is, it's just something that is obviously happening but doesn't affect too much. In terms of translation, this is probably where things are the most rough. Or maybe I should be more specific. The translation itself is fine, but the editing feels almost non-existent. It may be the case, in fact, that this is the worst edited script I've seen this generation. There's just a load of typos, missing or extra spaces, improper line breaks, really any manner of syntax error you can imagine. Chances are you'll find it here in spades. It can throw off your rhythm from time to time when you're reading, but it should never impact your understanding. I can see people maybe feeling the obscure riddles and hints in the game ended up being more obscure than intended, and they might want to blame the translation for that. But I fully believe that these riddles are carried over exactly how they're meant to be. In terms of extra content for after you beat the game, there's not a whole lot. But they do offer one bonus dungeon if you're looking for that last little extra challenge. The only other thing I want to point out here is that the game disappointingly only offers 15 save slots, which on PlayStation 2 makes sense, but not here. That's something they should have updated here, I feel, but I do at least like the save icons as each discovery gets a new one. And that's something from past games I really miss in modern ones. And that should about do it for the Kowloon High School Chronicle review. At the end of it all, Kowloon, like I said at the start, is undoubtedly a gem. However, a severe lack of polish may have some people finding it hard to truly appreciate this gem and look past its rough and rugged exterior to see the brilliant light that's shining within. Overall, it is a great game, but one that will only truly be appreciated by those willing to explore its eccentricities. And it's a game that took a hell of a lot out of me. I loved it, but I'm looking forward to just relaxing with an adventure game or a visual novel or something next before I jump into anything this hard again. So with that, that's all I'm going to say today. If you guys like this video, you know the deal. Like, comment, subscribe, and share the video if you can. Links to all of my socials and my Patreon support page are in the description below, and as always, folks, thanks for watching. So you guys ever run into this moment in an RPG? You're fighting the last boss, no heals left, no special attacks, no ammo, nothing but your weakest melee attack, and then this happens? Drop down to like 2 HP? Then following that, you still find a way to carry yourself through to victory after a 20-minute game of hit and run, cat and mouse? When I say this game took a lot out of me, I mean it, but man, the feeling of overcoming these situations, it's simply sublime.